Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. This week, Austin City Council will be voting on two resolutions pertaining to the fight back against Texas SB4, which was the draconian anti-immigration bill that made national news for its infringement on immigrant rights last year. What is at stake with the city council voting on these two items, and what precedent might that set for cities and organizations working to push back against attacks on immigrant communities at the local level? To talk about this, we are joined by Chris Harris, who's a data analyst and campaign coordinator for Grassroots Leadership, as well as Rebecca Sanchez, an immigration organizer and the visual projects coordinator for that same organization. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
I feel like SB4 has been out of sight, out of mind for some people, while obviously it's not for many communities and portions of communities around Texas. But I feel like people may have forgotten what this is all about. So can you tell us a little bit about what SB4 is and why we're now pushing for this kind of legislation?
Yeah, so SB4 was signed about this time last summer by Governor Greg Abbott, and it basically allowed local law enforcement to act like federal immigration enforcement. So they're able to ask about status. It made the conversation about ICE holds, which our current sheriff, Sally Hernandez, was advocately against initially. It allowed for local law enforcement to act like federal immigration, as well as prevented any sort of inhibitions to that. So local police, city governments, they can't make any sort of restrictions around what that enforcement looks like and what that collaboration with city, local officials, police departments, and immigration enforcement.
So it seems like it not only deputizes, again, this is legislation that was passed last year, but not only deputizes local law enforcement to be immigration officials, but it also seems to shield them from any sort of repercussions for what effect that might have on local communities.
That's exactly right. And, the other big thing is that, it was done largely in response to our local sheriff, Sally Hernandez's policy, which was implemented, I think, to a large degree due to pressure from organizations. I want to tout Grassroots Leadership a little bit on that front, and really making that an issue during her political candidacy, her race for sheriff. But at the conclusion of that, when she became sheriff, she implemented a policy that said she would only honor ICE detainer requests for certain very sort of more severe categories of offenses, and not just all blanket sort of respect for those. And also was going to kind of just kick ICE generally out of the jail so they wouldn't have a presence there like they had underneath the previous sheriff. And so what SB4 also did was it forced her to at least believe in her mind that she faced some sort of criminal repercussion for maintaining her policy, and led her to overturn it, such that she's now honoring all ICE detainer requests, even for, very, very low level offenses and for people that have been here for decades.
And ICE detainer requests, of course, are not de facto legal documents. They have been challenged over and over again, from my understanding, as far as how much legality they actually have. I think that says a lot about how ICE functions as an organization, where they can issue these detainers, where the very legal standing of ICE detainers is in question. And I feel like that says a lot about also the necessity when you have this kind of new sort of oppression that you're trying to impose on people, where you essentially have to pass more and more draconian things to even get this into the into the public mind as something that would even have to be done. I also think it says a lot that about where the center of power to really change this sort of thing comes, because you saw from what I saw a very easy capitulation by Sally Hernandez to the to ICE when this thing blew over, where she essentially protected her career, protected herself at the first sight of any sort of resistance. And I think that really says that we have to have these, well, I guess we would say we have to have grassroots leadership that is grassroots, in order to hold officials accountable in any sort of way, in order to hold any of these forces, whether it's forces of the state or whether it's civilian government, accountable for protecting their community in this sort of situation.
We immediately saw kind of a retraction on pretty much something that allowed her to even be a candidate, honestly. Whenever Sheriff Hamilton and his very cozy relationship with ICE was put into question, there was a lot of community pressure that he take a stand against. And whenever everyone realized he was not, then he did not run for re-election. Like, they completely changed the narrative on who can have the power to protect folks whenever it comes to such an aggressive enforcement agency. And that I remember that it was the only candidates for sheriff who were even allowed on stage or even allowed a space to talk about or to even be considered for candidate. Like, they had to have a very pro-immigrant, anti-ICE approach. Otherwise, they were just not going to be acceptable. So that on its own even created space for her to come in, for her to then immediately, like, at the sign of any sort of pushback, she caved pretty quickly. There was even, now we were able to kind of monitor, for a time, we were able to monitor how many folks had ICE detainers on a daily basis from the sheriff's website. And I think it was probably in September, whenever she got some more pushback from Ken Paxton, she removed that from the website and cited some of his language. And so she even made the information that we needed to figure out how to move forward inaccessible.
So this is a supposedly kind of progressive sheriff, whatever the heck that means, a sheriff who ran on a progressive platform, capitulating to Ken Paxton, who I believe is one of the most conservative voices in the Texas legislature, one of the most really reactionary people in Texas government, I'd say, at the moment. Just immediate capitulation to that.
Yeah. And I think it's just important to take a step back too and to realize, what these do. I mean, I think there's a lot of there's a lot of attention right now and a lot of focus on the situation at the border, and rightfully so, what's going on there in terms of how families are being split up and young children are being separated from their parents upon arrival. Even asylum seekers who come through standard port of entry, all of it is sickening. But that's happening also right here in our community. And it happens in a lot of different ways, but one of the biggest ways is through the jail. And it happens even for people that commit very low level offenses. They're put into jail, which on its own is a extremely traumatic experience and can lead to real degradation in people's lives, loss of jobs, loss of housing, loss of vehicles, loss of children. When you add in the potential that it could lead to indefinite detention and deportation, it's unacceptable. And so, that's why we're here. We're here to push back and to ensure that, to the degree possible, our local law enforcement isn't commissioned as a tool for Trump and Sessions' deportation regime. And really, this path that we're on to the worst forms of human suffering caused by the state.
Yeah, and I think that's been a real kind of shift in the tactics of organizations across the state, realizing that they can't really work with the state legislature in the kind of state that it's in the kind of climate that we're in. So instead working on whether it's local initiatives like what we're about to talk about, or whether it's simply bringing together this kind of grassroots, worker-oriented and immigrant-oriented and just generally people-oriented infrastructure where, kind of a bottom-up approach to show that there's going to be popular support and popular resistance when something like this goes into place. So I think this is a very interesting tactic that this campaign has brought together. The Grassroots Leadership, Workers Defense Project, and United We Dream for what I believe you're calling the Freedom City Policy Package. Correct?
Yes,
that's right.
Can you tell me how this first? How long has this been in the works? How did it first get started? And how has this come to fruition?
Well,
you got this one.
Yes. So actually, before SB4, there were a lot of conversations and a lot of push to get local officials to take a very drastic stand against ICE and put into city policy that we would not cooperate. That did not happen. The folks with power felt like that was a big push, and then the state comes right back and, hammers down as hard as they could. So an ongoing anti-ICE collaboration conversation has been going on for a very long time. I think right now, or in the past year, I would say, we at Grassroots and the folks that we have on the immigration organizing side in the coalition, we're really pushing for, it's very apparent, the overlaps in the criminal justice and the immigration machines, as we like to call, overlap so much. And so, we had to refine our focus. What does this look like? It doesn't mean that we can just talk for ICE collaboration anymore. I don't ever want to call that agency smart, but they are getting a lot more strategic in how they are getting folks. And it's not in the same way that we've been talking about it for the past couple of years or decades. So last year, I would say maybe last August, we had a real strong push to align these efforts because they already align for us, right? So I would say that conversation has probably been taking on since last September. And it's been a couple of months of a lot of back and forth and figuring out what we can do and what the city would be comfortable with as well. And now we are finally here.
And so there are two specific items as part of this Freedom City policy package that you're putting forth. Let's start with the first one, item 73, which is largely, from my understanding, directing the city to reduce racial disparities in the arrests made. Can you talk about the specifics of how you hope to do that?
Yeah, sure. So, I think one thing I really want to, make clear is that this is not just about immigration. This is also about really how the police in general are used as tools of racial oppression across this country, but also right here in our local community, and an attempting to limit the amount of oppression that they can enact upon our communities. And that includes both immigrant communities and really all communities of color. And so when we look at arrests in this town and really across the country, there's really outlandish racial disparities in who's being arrested. And that's across the board. If you then, this policy directs the city manager and the police chief to enact new policies to reduce that disparity. I think it's important to note that there's a lot of things at play with this. Obviously, racial bias on the part of individual police actors is a big part of it. There's also how the police are deployed, what neighborhoods they are told to patrol in, and then there's also what they are told to concentrate on, what resources they deploy to enforce what types of crimes. But then you also take a step back and is what are the actual crimes themselves, right? And so many of them have been literally their activities that have been criminalized for the purpose of targeting communities of color and poor people. And so the other main part of this resolution is not just to reduce racial disparities on the whole, but to eliminate a specific class of type of arrest, which is those that are what we call discretionary, meaning that the police officer at the point of the interaction with the individual has the option to give either a ticket or a citation, which basically serves as a summons to court, or they could arrest. And what we see is that, one, these are things that almost, virtually all people across the city of Austin would not consider public safety threats. Not considered things that we need to be focused on from a policing perspective. Again, these are laws designed to target communities of color in a lot of ways. But then, two, we see that the racial disparity increases when police have the discretion, right? So whereas about, for instance, 27% of arrests generally last year were of Black people in a town of 7% Black people. When we look at discretionary arrests, that goes up to more than 30%. So, again, when police have a choice, they're arresting communities of color, and that includes Black folks as well, much, much more. When we add in the fact that even these low-level offenses can be now put you in the pipeline to deportation for those that are undocumented, it became even more crucial for us to incorporate this as part of the policy. That, again, also includes this SB4 response component, the item 7.4 that we'll talk about here in a minute.
Yeah, there's so much there I'd love to follow up on if we had all the time in the world. One of the things I always really want to remind people of is just who actually is behind the police forces here in Austin, because people have this idea, or some people still have this idea, that the Austin police force is a so-called progressive police department or whatnot. But I always like to actually go into what I guess at this point, de facto police chief Brian Manley has actually done as part of his career. I am specifically thinking of his response in, I believe it was 2016 to a 2015 report that largely showed the same thing, that there was a clear pattern of police racial profiling and police, obviously the arrests were much higher of Black and brown people. And his response to that was, well, to say simply that most Black and brown people tend to be more impoverished, tend to have less income, and more crime takes place in low income neighborhoods. That was his kind of rationale for why police have to patrol like working class neighborhoods more frequently, and it was his rationale for explaining why police seem obviously target Black and brown people more. Was because they're also poor. What was the takeaway I got from that?
We heard it's been interesting. The police union chief has been outspoken against this policy, and in particular, we've been talking about how for low level marijuana possession, all right, so this is under 2 ounces of marijuana possession. Again, the police are authorized to give a citation instead of arrest folks for that. And what we see is that Black and brown people make up 75% of the arrests for low-level pot possession. Again, when that's the most serious charge. So even though they have this option for Black and brown folks, they are you're much more prone to get arrested. And his response to that was, well, we arrest around the same number of white people as we do Black folks and brown folks. So this is overblown. It's simple math, really. It's beyond him, apparently. 1 out of 10 and 1 out of 2, you both have 1, but 1 is much worse when you're talking about half versus a tenth. So, again, in a town of, about 45% Black and brown people and again, 7% Black folks, for Black and brown folks to make up 75% of the arrests for low-level pot possession, also about 75% of the arrests for driving with a suspended license, which is the other really big bucket of these. It's unacceptable, and it shows, again, the racial oppression component that's really integral to policing and part of the package that you get when you talk about police enforcement, both at the individual level, but also at the upper level echelons when we talk about how things are enforced and what gets enforced.
And we see this over and over and over and over again. Whenever the police do have discretion to decide who it is they arrest, to decide what actions to take, it seems like the more discretion the police legally have, the more you will see these patterns of racial discrimination. I'm thinking of the same thing with stop and frisk, and before that, the broken windows policy. This just continually seems to happen. So, turning back to the actual items here, the item 73, the idea here is to, eliminate these low-level, nonviolent, misdemeanor discretionary arrests, such as small amounts of marijuana, et cetera, et cetera. What else within item 73, or if we want to continue item 74, what else is there to kind of this package?
Well, yeah. So the other side of it is item 74, which is the SB4 response. And Rebecca, you're probably better to talk about that.
Yeah. So in the limited arena of what we are able to do, and I do want to make sure that we stress that we find this to be a necessary first step. We are not in the camp of like, this is going to be the end all. Like, this is a beginning trajectory for hopefully pushing local officials a little bit stronger and countywide as well. So for us, we have to be a little bit more creative in what we can do and what we can ask under SB4. But also, again, like I said earlier, ICE is very blatantly just kind of doing whatever they want. So as much, guidance as we want to give to like make sure that local law enforcement isn't enacting with ICE, that may or may not be the trajectory. But what we do know is that police are aware that any interaction that they have with the undocumented community is de facto could potentially lead to deportation. So I think what we are trying to highlight is that police are very much a vital point in somebody's deportation trip. And that's what we need the police department to recognize, as well as the city. So on the SB4 pieces, or the SB4 response, we really have no idea of knowing. And I spoke to earlier Sally Hernandez taking away the public information that we are able to view as far as how many detainers were happening on a daily basis and how many folks were getting caught up in that. So what we're pushing the city to do is create quarterly reports anytime immigration enforcement asks to use our resources, even if we allow them to do or not. And to also release that information to us publicly immediately after it happens. So quarterly reports on whatever they are asking for, any sort of local resources, and what that looked like, as well as letting us know immediately after. So I know that that's not the most preventative method, but again, we're trying to be as creative as we can under SB4.
Yeah, and I think that also really says something about how little the forces of, I guess what you could consider monopolized state violence, that is to say the forces within government that are allowed, or within government or within the, the state, kind of broadly, like theoretically speaking, the state, how little they actually have to answer to anyone within the public currently, how little responsibility they have to show where our resources are going. At this point, we're at a point where even police resources take up massive amounts of city budgets. I think people would be amazed to realize that well over, in any given major American city, I'd say well over half of the city budget goes to kind of police and other forces of reaction rather than forces of, if you're going to be talking about social problems in that way. Again, I see police differently. But if you're going to be talking about like sort of a reaction to a problem versus like a prevention of a problem versus like mental health versus social services, necessary social services, instead it's simply wait till people are mentally ill, wait till people are severely impoverished and homeless, and that at that point react to repress their very existence. Circling back around, it seems amazing how little the public can actually hold any of these forces accountable. But I think it also speaks to the history of police forces themselves. If you look at most police departments, they either started as kind of private mercenary forces for very wealthy individuals. They started as kind of union busters. A lot of times, a lot of local police departments started as kind of union busters to bust up working class solidarity. And then the other kind of root of police forces is like slave patrols during the pre-Civil War era, at which point these forces have then continued basically a trajectory since that point, since the 1800s of first of all being turned from these private forces into a quote unquote public force, but without the accountability that a public force should have. There's been no real kind of point of reformation or major sort of social revolution that would cause them to have a different class character. So I think a lot of times we're seeing police do the same things. I think police are serving in many ways the same function by cracking down on immigrants now that they were when they were the slave patrol so long ago.
Yeah, I mean, they're the entry point into these systems really, to a large degree, both immigration and criminal justice, that kind of our, operating procedure at Grassroots is that these are very intertwined and in a lot of ways very similar systems designed to oppress Black and brown folks. And it's been enabled by politicians that stoke fear about crime and other things. Mm-hmm. But it really is, they're design tools, and the police are just a part of that, to limit Black and brown voting capability, right? It's political actors attempting to ensure that people can't participate in this government in a way that would limit their power. And it's a way to control Black and brown labor. It's a way to keep Black and brown people either working for virtual slavery, actually locked up in incarceration or detention in some form, or to ensure that they're part of an underclass of people that cannot get work and have to take an underground forms of labor that depress their wages in perpetuity and create sort of generational poverty. And so the police are really the front end to these systems. And to the degree that we can limit their ability to criminalize us and to pull us into these systems, I think this is a start. As Rebecca said, this isn't by any means going to create a completely free and inclusive and open and sanctuary for all Austin, but it is a start for us.
Yeah, and I also just want to highlight death in general. Like, this is about Black and brown death. This is a vital piece in making sure that they keep these populations as limited as possible. Like, police folks know the degradation and dehumanization that goes on in prisons, and yet we freely just allow these systems to eradicate, to flourish, and make money and to profit off of this pain. Like, yes, harm into their livelihoods, but also, like, this is about making sure these people cease to exist as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the rise of just getting into a little bit more history here, the rise of the kind of prison industrial complex really corresponded also with the deindustrialization of the U.S. When the U.S. started to essentially export its capital elsewhere to especially kind of East Asia. That was the point at which there was obviously huge economic recessions. There was a huge economic decline that's essentially been building ever since that point. We never really had a recovery, even from 2008, not a real economic recovery for workers. But so much of the unemployment that has really happened, the really national level of unemployment that's happened, has been really absorbed by simply locking up this kind of reserve population, these people who no longer have jobs, who simply, if you allow that unemployment to reach a critical mass, you're going to have major kind of riots, revolts, and eventually a revolution on your hand. If you just simply throw millions of people in prison where they're in cages all day, you can, I mean, that's the goal there, is to control that unemployed population, and then at the same time put them in different areas, essentially keep them from being in the people who are locked up, keep them from being in their home areas where they can still be in contact with their family, with their community. And then at the same time, it also provides kind of an employment strategy for a small number of otherwise unemployable kind of rural white class that then becomes the jailers and then becomes that. Understanding why we have the prison industrial complex, and understanding how to develop, and then of course how to create meaningful change to push back against that. Understanding this is not the be all end all, but simply a start to providing some sort of accountability for these systems that have just gone completely out of control for so many decades, that have been largely unchecked for so many decades as the American left has kind of deteriorated, and trying to, as we rebuild a left, as we rebuild a real independent people's movement for real justice for the people rather than justice for the 1%, trying to get also this so that people can see that accountability in action, I think is real important. So recapping, we have been talking with Chris Harris and Rebecca Sanchez, both of Grassroots Leadership. This is an organization working at the intersection of criminal justice and immigration issues. we are talking about two specific items that are called the Freedom City Policy Package, item 73 and item 74 that are going to be voted on. It's this Thursday, correct?
Yeah. That's correct. And we anticipate that they're going to come up after the dinner break at council. And so there will be a rally that evening. And so everyone can find out more information about that on Grassroots Leadership Facebook page. In terms of when that will be, but probably around 6 p.m. And we hope the vote will happen sometime between then and 8 p.m. And so for anyone that is able to come and to speak, that would be much appreciated. You can sign up for the items there at City Hall, and there will be a lot of folks there to help out as well. So you can seek out folks to see how you can participate on the day of. There's also a petition to sign that can also be accessed from the Grassroots Leadership webpage, which is grassrootsleadership.org. And again, this will go to the city council folks and let them know that you are in support of the Freedom City policy, and will be really helpful.
Any sort of last thoughts before we wrap up, either on the importance of these two, or just generally more kind of theoretical ideas on police in general, or on SB4?
Well, I actually wanted to comment whenever you were talking about what hypercriminalization and mass incarceration has looked like. And the reason for, I just want to kind of compliment and re-invoke that those same, whenever we started criminalizing immigration in 1996, thank you, Bill Clinton, it is only increased. And with Jeff Sessions, they're trying to remove a mass population that either is new here or has foundation and roots here, and charge them. And similarly, force folks into these detention systems, in which we have one about 30 minutes away from us, the Tidon Hutto Detention Center. And I'm sure, as folks have seen on TV, force these kids into other spaces that are also privately run or run by our military, all in the name of profit and in the name of public safety. So I just want to re-highlight just how in-line and overlapped we are talking whenever it comes to immigration and criminal justice.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's important to just note that for, it's really important for Black and brown communities in particular to unite around these issues, because they use different labels for us in a lot of ways, but the labels have many of the same effects in terms of, again, limiting our ability to participate meaningfully in voting and participation in our government, as well as in economy in any way. And so when you hear people called undocumented, when you hear people called illegal, when you hear people called an ex-con or a convict or any of these terms, I just would ask you to question that and to understand that a lot of these labels are intended for a purpose, but not because it reflects anything about that individual, but more about what people are trying to do to individuals that look like them.
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, we've been speaking with Chris Harris and Rebecca Sanchez of Grassroots Leadership. They are working on a new initiative, the Freedom City Policy. A couple of items. They're going to be on this week's City Council vote. That's going to be on Thursday evening. That's going to be item 73 and item 74. You can find more information about Grassroots Leadership and their initiatives at grassrootsleadership.org. Stay tuned for more People's Republic in just a moment. Welcome back to People's Republic. My name is Brian Griffith, and I continue to be joined this week with Chris Harris and Rebecca Sanchez, both of Grassroots Leadership, an organization working at the intersection of criminal justice and immigration issues. We are talking about the upcoming city council votes on several items. First, we discussed items 73 and 74, together known as the Freedom City Policy Package. And now we have a couple more items on the agenda that we would like to discuss a little bit. This is items 68 and 65. So can you tell us a little bit about what these are all about?
Yeah, sure. So on 73 and 74, we are, of course, very strongly in favor. On 65 and 68, we are very, very much opposed. So I believe it's item 65 is directing the city to give back some stipends, basically perks, to the police department that they lost when they walked away from the negotiations back last December after the city council voted to reject a proposed new contract with them. And so these stipends were originally returned to them for a few months, and they recently expired at the end of May. And that was done in an attempt to get the police back to the table and to agree to an interim deal, which they rejected. And so now they've once again rejected a deal that would have returned some money to them, and instead are trying to go through the council to get this money returned to them, basically in perpetuity, not through these normal contract labor negotiations, but through City Hall. And we're talking about millions and millions of dollars. It was estimated that the 3 months that they were originally given back these pay stipends, it was about $2 million worth. And this particular resolution that's on the agenda for Thursday, it has no end date. It says that they get the stipends until a new deal is reached, a new labor agreement is reached with them, meaning that they get them for as long as they want. And it also, of course, gives them an enormous amount of leverage in those negotiations because they know that they will never get less than these stipends back because they don't have to agree to that. They're going to keep getting them even if they don't agree to a deal. So in addition to just being really a detriment to the cities and the community's efforts to increase accountability and oversight of the police through these negotiations, it also is, again, just taking resources, as you mentioned earlier, Brian, could be utilized in ways that help to prevent various types of social issues, things like substance use treatment, mental health treatment, youth programs, all sorts of other things that could better address public safety in our community. And it just gives them to the police as bonuses. And again, this is a police force here in Austin that is already the highest paid in the state, and that's base pay. That's without considering these stipends.
So I would assume if someone were to offer me millions of dollars essentially handed to me in perpetuity, it would be in response for, I imagine, such a massively great deed of work that my debt or that the society's debt to me can never be paid. I would have to do something truly fantastic for me or for any organization I was working with to be just handed that much money by the city council. I don't know that I've seen that from Austin Police Department ever, or specifically, I think since the Austin bombings really should have been a huge wake up call to people as to how the Austin Police Department functions. When the first bombing victim, Anthony Stephen House, was killed, they implied, I don't think they outright accused, but they implied that he was a drug dealer. They implied that he had a hand in his own death. Essentially, they did not take the investigation seriously until several bombings later, until I think it was the second and third took place pretty much at the same time, or it may have been the third and fourth, I forget. At which point they were basically really not responding to anybody. They were stonewalling everyone as to where they were. I understand that during an active investigation, you can only say so much, but I really felt like they were giving us no information as to how to keep ourselves safe or anything that could have protected us whatsoever. And then, of course, there was now de facto police chief Brian Manley's real heartfelt sympathy for the Austin bomber after he had displayed absolute reckless disregard for the victims, where he, saw this this video recording where the Austin bomber essentially, the Austin bomber had said he's a psychopath. He described himself as a psychopath. He said he felt no remorse, et cetera, et cetera. Truly chilling stuff, to which Brian Manley said that this is a work of a troubled young man, and that it became but after all of this, all of the sort of racial double standards with this, then the city council seemed to treat Manley in particular, but the rest of the police department as these absolute heroes for what I consider to be an absolutely botched and racist investigation. So for them to be going to the city council now after that and expecting this huge multi-million-dollar handout just seems, I mean, to anyone else it would seem tone deaf, but it seems like the city council might be pretty amenable to that sort of situation.
Yeah, and I think wholeheartedly agree. And also, I think people seem to forget that it wasn't the Austin Police Department that even right before, federal agencies were coming into our city. I don't know if you all remember, but they pretty much put a plea out asking if the guy if he could come forward or anything else. Like it was very much like, we don't know what to do. And so it was horribly done from all angles. And so for the city to applaud the police department as if they solved the crime, everything points to that they didn't. And it was actually external forces that helped us figure that out.
Yeah, and I think that, the other big part of this is, again, we have this situation where we unfortunately have to bargain for our own lives as it relates to police accountability and oversight through this labor negotiation with the police union. And what that means is that anytime we go, or the city goes to them and says, hey, can you ensure that officers that commit brutality or misconduct are actually punished? Can you ensure that the records about their misconduct and brutality aren't hidden? Can you ensure that the community is made aware of or shown any video of acts of brutality and misconduct? We actually have to pay the police department for that service through these labor negotiations, and for them to go to the city to get money around these negotiations only means that at that bargaining table, they're going to get more and more money for the things that we might ask for in that regard, because now they've already got this money. So what else, what are we going to give to them to get something else? Well, more money. So every bit of it matters, and it matters not just in terms of the city and sort of our priorities and the budget, which is important. And I think, Rebecca, you and your work with Communities of Color United also, in terms of the city budget, should be highlighted here. But it also means that we know that much less about what the police do. We know that much less about the misconduct and brutality they commit, and we can expect the police will continue to get away with it because we can't pay them to ensure that they receive any punishment.
Yeah, I think Spencer Cronk's memo yesterday, Spencer Cronk, our new city manager's memo the other day, highlighted that Manly is going to be working towards racial equity. And I forgot what were the other areas of concern, but I did an interview yesterday and I had to kind of hold myself, because for the police department to get such a huge chunk of the city budget and to not ever consider that as part of the racial equity conversation is just laughable. Like, for them not to understand, or they do, but for not to hold on to how much of the city resources they are taking for themselves and in the name of public safety for all, as opposed to the needs of the rest of the city, is just a disgrace. Which,
of course, as we've talked about at quite length, they have not met the needs of much of the city at all. They've met the needs of a very small, wealthy portion of the city. Beyond that, I don't think there are many people who I know who feel much safer knowing that the Austin Police Department is being handed so many more millions of dollars of money, or might be, according to, again, that's item 68 on the city council agenda this coming Thursday. There's another one you want to mention as well. That's item 65. Can you tell me a little bit about what this is? And I believe this is also another one you're opposing, correct?
That's correct. And it's an item that is a tax break to property owners. So it's a homestead exemption increase. And the estimates I've heard are that it's going to cost the city around $5 million, which, if you spread that out across much of the city that owns property, it's an extremely small amount. And so it seems as though it's mostly a political tool to say that some sort of tax cut was passed. But all it does is, again, further hamstring the city's ability to do anything. If we think about the discretionary budget of the city budget, the part of the budget that isn't already set aside for other things that our city council actually gets to allocate to different programs or purposes. Each year during budget time, it's actually a very small amount of money that ultimately ends up where they get to choose. And again, a big part of it is, as you mentioned, the public safety budgets. And I want to highlight the police portion of that. Overall, when you can throw in fire and EMS, it's about 2/3 of the budget. Police themselves are over 40%. And then when we get down to what do we as a community have that we can go to our city council and advocate that they create as far as new services or programs to address public safety and other needs of our community, it ends up being in the single digit of millions many years. And so for them to try and give potentially $2+ million or however much it ends up being back to the police as part of these perks, depending on how long the negotiations last, and then maybe another $5 million in these homestead exemptions, you really start to hamstring our community's ability to do anything else as far as meet the vast needs that we have. And obviously we're in the midst of a conversation right now about homelessness in this city, about mental health treatment in this city, with the vote to not approve the new women's jail. There's a conversation happening about substance use treatment in the city. And what we're seeing is that we don't have much of any of these things. And we need a lot more. And we need it because it's going to, one, help ensure that people are able to avoid the criminal justice system and all the negative consequences that come with that, but also so that we actually as a city have more and better public safety, and we as a city actually feel more safe and more free. And instead, to throw that money to property owners or to the police is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing, and it really hurts everyone.
Yeah, and of course, when you have a tax cut like that, when you the same thing kind of happens whether it's on the local level or whether it's on the national level, where essentially the tax cut is almost always coming from the top or 1% that get the entire benefits within Austin. Those who I know there are, of course, many homeowners who are trying very desperately to hang on to a home that they may have had in Austin before the kind of booms that have happened here. But generally, I feel like that money is going to be handed more to wealthy landowners. But then, of course, that gets balanced not on the repressive services, whether that's at the national level, that when they have a tax break, when they have less revenue coming in, they're not going to then say, oh, we need to slash the military budget. That always gets balanced on social services. And I feel like that's what's going to happen here as well.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, some of the folks that I have the honor of working with, a group called Communities of Color United, pushed for the equity office, the establishment of the Austin Equity Office. And so city council passed that. And that's about as far as it's gone. They have a handful of staff, but it is something that is not as funded as it should be to address equity across the city and in all different departments. I think only a handful of departments have actually been able to utilize the equity tool that they have created to even just assess where the needs are across the city. So this handing over of money to the police really shows the priorities of the council as we see it.
How do you feel that these might play out? The four different ones we've talked about, where do you feel like the balance of power lies at this moment?
That's a great question. Well, I feel pretty confident about our Freedom City policy. That said, we could still use people signing the petition and showing up on June 14th. Again, that's Thursday, to participate. But I think that we feel like we've, that's going to pass. The Freedom City policy is going to pass. That I think it's still unknown and up in the air about these other two items. And again, 65 and 68 are things that currently appear to be right on the line in terms of having enough support or not. And so if people are able to contact their council member and/or go to City Hall and register against these items, and even better if folks are able to come out on Thursday and actually speak against these items, and as well as for our Freedom City policy, that would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, and of course, that's always a loaded question, asking whether you think it's going to pass or not, because you don't want to say, oh, yeah, we already got this. And you certainly don't want to say, oh, no, we totally going to, like.
Exactly. Well, you never know. And obviously, there's still a few days left. Things aren't etched in stone, these policies. Unfortunately, we don't. We didn't get to bring them from on high on the stone tablet. So there are people now and forces now attempting to write them and edit them in all sorts of different ways. And so we'll see where they end up. But I think that generally we feel confident, and we feel like there's a lot of community support for these, and that the council will ultimately do the right thing in the face of a lot of community that's going to show up on Thursday.
The two takeaways from me here, the two kind of things that I would leave people with are the importance of understanding what the forces within any local, regional, and national situation are, understanding where people's interests lie, and having to work both within and sort of against those systems at the same time at many times, both trying to understand like what the possibilities are, and then like push it into a direction that ultimately represents a more progressive and long-term change, understanding where the limits are at this particular moment. And the other thing, of course, is that ultimately at the backing, and we can see this over and over again at the behind the any sort of progressive push, whether this was the kind of New Deal in the 1930s, whether this was a civil rights movement and the anti-war movement in the 1960s, when you look at the roots of these movements, and when you look at the legislation that got passed at any given point, this was never legislation that all of the politicians already agreed on, and simply they just needed that little push. No, this was the legislation in a positive direction within this country has always been as a what in a progressive direction. I don't know what positive really means. That can mean different things to different people. Legislation in a progressive direction, I feel like, has always been as a reaction and a concession to popular mass movements that have come together around a particular issue. It really, really, really requires more than anything the people to develop these independent, working class and oppressed infrastructure, not oppressed infrastructures, but infrastructures of oppressed peoples working together in unity to bring about the sort of changes that we want to see. Any sort of last thoughts before we wrap it up?
No, just thank you so much for your time. And again, you can find us on Facebook, Grassroots Leadership, also grassrootsleadership.org. And you can sign up to receive information about this and future campaigns, as well as to sign the petition about the Freedom City policy, which again will be considered next Thursday evening, sometime between 6 and 8. And we'll also have a rally out there in front of City Hall, and we hope to see everybody out there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Once again, this has been Brian Griffith. I've been talking with Chris Harris, data analyst and campaign coordinator with Grassroots Leadership, as well as Rebecca Sanchez, the immigration organizer and visual projects coordinator, also of Grassroots Leadership, which is an organization based in Austin, working at the intersection of criminal justice and immigration issues. Thank you both for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
That's all we have for this week. You've been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic. Or you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. Thank you for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here. From the producers of People's Republic comes Empire Supernova, a study of the social, economic, and political forces driving the global realignment of U.S. empire. We examine the censored histories and uncomfortable truths around the U.S. surveillance state and its military counterpart, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, featuring expert analysis from commentators such as Joe Loria, editor-in-chief of Consortium News.
We now know that the FBI put an informant inside the Trump campaign. That informant was a guy called Stephen Halpert. He goes back to the 1980 presidential campaign, in which he infiltrated the Carter re-election campaign on behalf of the Reagan campaign.
Abby Martin, host of the Empire Files on Telesur.
How do you reason with an opposition who are just willing and ready to basically undemocratically seize power in terms of military coup and encouraging fascist silence constantly?
And Brian Becker, national coordinator for the Answer Coalition.
If we, the left, the progressives, are spectators, nothing good's going to come of it. That's a road to nowhere. If we want to be serious about fighting back against Trump's reactionary policies, we can't be following the Democratic Party elites, and we can't be spectators. We have to be grassroots organizers and mobilizers and resistors.
We reveal the state and corporate actors bringing NATO and its allies toward a new and deadly end goal, that of nuclear war with Russia and China.
Do we want a country where intelligence agencies can get involved in a presidential election and try to meddle with it? The way they claim Russia did, it looks more likely that our intelligence agencies did.
The U.S. Nuclear Posture Review, now released National Security Strategy document, has been released, which shows that the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies are girding for a major power confrontation. It's not against ISIS, it's not against Al-Qaeda, it's against the major power confrontation with Russia or China during the coming decades.
The Empire Supernova podcast is now available at patreon.com/Empire Supernova.